Welcome to the deep dive. We've gathered the research, the articles, and the academic papers, and today we're really digging into the modern welfare state, specifically how it came to be and, well, the pressures pushing it towards decline now. It's interesting, isn't it? You look at global rankings for quality of life, productivity, equality, and the Nordic model is almost always near the top. It gets held up everywhere as this blueprint for success.
Yeah, it does.
But here's the puzzle we found in our sources. How can this celebrated model simultaneously be described from the inside as being under attack, facing serious corrosion, maybe even fighting forces that could pull down the whole thing?
That paradox is exactly what we want to explore for you. The authors we looked at argue this decline, well, it isn't just a system getting old or failing passively.
Okay.
In their analysis, it's the result of really fundamental, deliberate shifts in where power lies in society. They actually call it the neoliberal attack, the sustained political and ideological pressure, starting back in the 80s, aimed squarely at rolling back those comprehensive safety nets.
So the idea is to look past the budgets and look at the power plays. Right, let's unpack this. Before we get into the attack itself, we probably need to understand how these systems, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, were even built. It wasn't just good intentions, Ben, sounded like it was more of a delicate political deal.
Oh, absolutely. It was a political construction, really forged out of conflict. The welfare state mostly came about after World War II from what's often called a social contract, or maybe more accurately, class cooperation.
Class cooperate.
Yeah, but the key thing, the absolute precondition for Western capitalists agreeing to things like high taxes and, broad social cooperation was the system rivalry with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
You mean plain old fear drove it?
Essentially, yes. There was a genuine fear among capitalists about their own working classes becoming radicalized, maybe looking towards socialism. And that fear made them much more willing to accept comprehensive welfare rules, strong unions, high taxes. It was almost like a strategic move to buy social peace and keep the basic capitalist structure intact.
So that's the big trade-off then. The labor movement's got huge wins on Social Security, universal health care, education, pensions, things that really boosted security and quality of life for regular people.
Definitely.
But in return, they had to give up some core political goals.
They did. Take Norway, for instance. In 1949, the main labor union, LO, actually removed the aim of socializing the means of production from its charter. That was huge. It basically signaled that organized labor would work within capitalism, not try to replace it.
And in exchange, the market got sort of tamed, regulated to fund this collective security.
Exactly. The market forces were contained. And this created an incredibly popular system, Because these services were universal, high quality, people didn't see the welfare state as charity. It was seen as a right, a fundamental security mechanism. It's interesting, the source argues that while traditional liberalism often talks about freedom from the state, the labor movement saw freedom and equality as linked. Freedom through collective organization. That collective security meant, getting sick or losing your job didn't mean losing your dignity or your place in society. That basic idea held for decades.
Okay, so that foundation, that bargain, started to weaken around the 1970s.
Yeah.
You have global shocks like stagflation and then this aggressive rise of market fundamentalism.
Yeah.
This is where the deliberate dismantling seems to begin. How did they even manage to sell this reversal politically? That's the fascinating part to me.
Well, the sources argue it wasn't just one thing, but a very systematic approach. They break it down into three main strategies, all designed to shift power away from democratic politics and towards, capital.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is deregulation. This was all about removing the rules that restricted capital's movement. Historically, companies were more tied to a place. If a government raised taxes, capital didn't have many options. But once capital can just pack up and leave a country easily, it gains what the sources call a veto right over national policy.
Hang on, a veto right. How does that actually work? Does a CEO just call up the prime minister and say no?
Well, maybe not quite like that. It's more about the implicit threat. If a government even proposes something like better sick pay or higher corporate taxes, big companies or investors can just threaten to move their money, their factories, their jobs somewhere else, somewhere with lower taxes or fewer regulations.
Okay. So it's economic leverage dictating policy, not democratic choice.
Precisely. It shifts control away from elected officials towards the demands of global finance. And the goal, some argue, is to create this race to the bottom for taxes and social standards.
That makes a scary amount of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the second part of this strategy?
The second was privatization, just a massive transfer of things owned by the public into private hands.
We're talking state industries, utilities.
Yeah, exactly. State-owned companies, communications networks, transport systems, energy, water, even chunks of social services. The scale was enormous. The sources point out that globally, privatization hit this incredible peak in 1998. We're talking transactions worth $170 billion. That was 5 times the amount, just 8 years before. Public wealth basically became private profit opportunities.
Wow. And the third part, you mentioned ideological warfare. This explains how they got public buy-in, or at least acceptance. The source says this wasn't just a natural shift in thinking.
Not according to these authors, no. It was heavily driven by the rise of dedicated think tanks. Like the Heritage Foundation in the US or Timbro in Sweden. These were well-funded, often by powerful business groups.
And their job was?
Their job was to relentlessly push the economic theories of people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek, supply-side free market ideas, to make these radical ideas seem like common sense, almost inevitable, even if the facts didn't always back them up.
And to make this stick inside the government itself, they needed a tool. That's where this term new public management, or NPM, comes in.
Yeah.
It sounds quite technical. How would you explain NPM to someone who hasn't heard of it?
NPM was basically the operational game plan for changing how the public sector worked. It meant reorganizing public services like hospitals, schools, social work agencies to run like private businesses.
So performance metrics, efficiency targets, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Instead of a nurse or a teacher being primarily judged on, say, patient well-being or student learning, suddenly they're measured on market-like metrics.
Like hitting monthly quotas, cutting costs per unit, processing paperwork faster.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Services got broken down into these sort of competitive units, cost centers. The focus shifted from the collective social goal towards individual efficiency and, frankly, accounting. And the sources argue this was crucial.
Way crucial.
Because by making the public sector act and feel like a collection of private businesses, it made it politically much easier down the line for actual private companies to argue they could just take over those services entirely. Health, education, you name it.
Okay, which leads us right to the big contradiction here. The whole sales pitch for neoliberalism, low taxes, deregulation, privatization, was that it would unleash growth and make everyone better off. Did it actually work out that way?
Oh, the data suggests not really, at least not in the way it was promised. There's a really significant 2006 Canadian study mentioned in the sources. It did a deep dive comparing the high-tax Nordic countries with the low-tax Anglo-American ones, like the US and UK, across 50 different social and economic indicators.
Okay, so the low-tax champions versus the high-tax welfare states. How did they stack up?
The Nordic countries actually came out ahead in 42 out of those 50 indicators.
42 out of 50.
Yep, that's 84%. So on things like poverty rates, life expectancy, economic security for citizens, income equality, the high-tax regulated welfare states were, according to this study, demonstrably better for the average person's life.
That really flies in the face of the narrative pushed by those think tanks for decades, doesn't it?
It does, and the irony gets deeper. Deregulation was supposed to kickstart economies, right?
Yeah, unleash growth.
But actually, the period after the 1980s saw overall growth rates drop in many Western countries compared to the post-war decades. So it wasn't exactly a recipe for widespread prosperity. And while, the Nordic countries still look good on those big international league tables, which is why they still get praise, the sources really emphasize the growing human costs inside these systems. The corrosion from these neoliberal policies is real. The system is changing, and it's hitting individuals hard, even somewhere supposedly successful like Norway.
Which brings us to that tough story you mentioned about Jane from Moss in Norway. She worked for 30 years, held responsible jobs like transport manager, then became disabled. Her experience seems to capture this shift towards a more bureaucratic, maybe even cruel system.
Jane's story really highlights this loss of dignity. When she couldn't work anymore and needed disability support, she just got lost in this administrative nightmare.
Mountains of paperwork.
Endless paperwork, yeah. Having to fill out the same forms over and over. And crucially, her original diagnosis, something quite specific, ankylosing spondylitis, was apparently rejected. She was then given a new diagnosis, fibromyalgia, by medical staff she never even met face-to-face.
Wow. So the system felt like it was actively working against her, not trying to help. You mentioned she felt under suspicion.
That's exactly her quote. She said the whole process made her feel under suspicion the whole time, deeply humiliated. She felt the authorities seemed designed to work against people. It really drives home this idea that if you aren't working, you're somehow suspect, just, living off the state.
That kind of bureaucratic grinding down seems directly linked to the policy shifts towards work for welfare, the Arbeid for Wetels idea in Norway. The focus shifts away from support or rehabilitation towards just pushing people into any job, right? Regardless of whether they're actually capable.
That's the core of it. And this intense pressure often leads to what the sources call the brutalization of work. Pushing people back into the workforce, even when they're not physically or mentally ready, just ramps up stress and pressure across the board.
So the system potentially makes people sicker.
It can end up creating more illness and exclusion, yeah. All because the priority becomes hitting performance targets, getting people off the books, rather than focusing on genuine human well-being.
It sounds like a feedback loop. The system creates hardship, then makes people jump through punishing hoops to get help, which connects directly to the bigger political picture, because these economic changes didn't just affect individuals, they seem to weaken democracy itself.
That's probably the most alarming conclusion in the source material. The authors really stress this point. The public was never really asked democratically if they wanted mass privatization or these kinds of budget cuts. These policies were often pushed through in ways that bypassed normal democratic debate, driven by powerful economic interests.
How did that actually happen? How does democracy get weakened in practice?
Yeah.
The sources seem to break it down into three mechanisms.
Yeah, they identify three main ways this happens. First, there's political retreat. This one's fairly straightforward.
Okay.
When you deregulate capital so it can leave easily, and when you sell off public assets like railways or hospitals, politicians simply lose the power to control those areas democratically. The state has retreated from those responsibilities.
So the scope of what politics can actually influence just shrinks. Makes sense. What's the second one?
Second is political blockage. This is more internal, sometimes harder to see.
This is the NPM stuff again.
Exactly. New public management plays a key role here. By creating all these semi-independent agencies, boards, and management structures, political power gets shifted to unelected managers and bureaucrats.
So decisions about vital public services get insulated from public opinion or political direction.
That's the effect. Accountability gets diffused, hidden behind layers of management jargon and performance metrics. It blocks direct democratic oversight.
Okay, retreat, blockage, and the third mechanism.
The third is political bypass. This is where national decision-making gets overridden or constrained by external forces.
Like international agreements or organizations.
Absolutely. Think about the rise of supranational bodies. The European Union is often mentioned. The sources point to its well-known democracy deficit, but also institutions like the European Central Bank, the World Trade Organization. These bodies create binding rules, often very market-focused rules, that limit what national governments can actually do democratically.
So wait, are the sources saying that democratic governments themselves set up these external bodies partly to limit their own future democratic options, to bypass their own voters?
That's a strong interpretation, but it's certainly consistent with the core argument. The idea is that these international rules and institutions help lock in a certain market-oriented direction, making it much harder for any future elected government to significantly change course, even if they have a democratic mandate to do so. The scope for real political choice gets smaller and smaller.
Okay, this paints a pretty stark picture. If the decline isn't accidental, but a result of these deliberate power shifts, then just tinkering around the edges, a small funding increase here, a minor policy tweak there isn't going to cut it.
Exactly.
So what's the alternative? Does the source material offer any way forward?
The authors are quite clear. It requires tackling the dominant ideology head-on and focusing on changing these fundamental power structures. They don't offer easy answers, but they do suggest some concrete, albeit pretty radical directions society could take.
Such as?
Well, one major area is getting control back over finance. They talk about stopping the purely speculative economy. That could mean things like reintroducing capital controls.
Making it harder for money to just flood out of a country instantly.
Right. Making capital stick around and serve national goals again. Also, banning certain kinds of high-risk speculative financial products. They even raise the possibility of nationalizing banks to ensure finance serves the real economy, not just itself.
Reintroducing capital controls.
Yeah.
That would be a massive political fight. But the idea is to give governments back the leverage they lost.
That seems to be the goal, yes. To shift the power balance back towards democratic decision-making so governments aren't constantly held hostage by the threat of capital flight.
Okay, beyond finance, what about the impact on workers? That brutalization of work idea.
The focus there has to be on reversing that trend. So radically strengthening unions, really prioritizing workers' rights, and dismantling the aspects of NPM, that management culture that led to stories like Jane's. And ultimately, they argue for a much deeper democratization, not just of politics, but of the economy itself, taking power back from those unaccountable economic actors.
So the key takeaway for you listening seems to be this. The welfare state, especially the comprehensive Nordic version, wasn't some kind of gift. It was a political achievement, won through struggle and compromise, and maybe even enabled by unique geopolitical circumstances. And its current challenges aren't just bad luck or inefficiency. According to these sources, it's the result of deliberate, systematic changes aimed at shifting power and wealth upwards.
And that leaves us with a final, maybe challenging thought from the source material. Remember how we said the labor movement's original goal wasn't just about equality in numbers, but about emancipation?
Yeah, freedom through collective security.
Right, the freedom for people to actually live fulfilling lives, pursue their goals, without being constantly crushed by economic insecurity. So the question the sources implicitly pose is this. When political choices allow market power and wealth to become incredibly concentrated in the hands of a few, what does that really do to the freedom and dignity of everyone else?
It's definitely something to think about. Who really benefits from the way things are structured now? And what does that mean for your own security, your own freedom down the line? Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.